Case 1, Jake Mitchell, Haro, and baby Emmanuel. Riverside County, California, 2025. The morning Emmanuel disappeared began like any other in Yucaipa. A warm breeze passed through the quiet streets. Dogs barked in the distance. Sprinklers clicked on in neat rows along front yards. Inside a small home near 4th Street, 7-month-old Emmanuel Haro should have been waking up to a bottle and his mother's arms. Instead, a call went out saying he had vanished. His father, Jake, who sometimes went by Mitchell, told deputies he had taken Emmanuel for a walk. He said he stepped away for just a moment, and when he turned back, the stroller was empty. Neighbors came outside when patrol cars lined the block. Some clutched coffee mugs. Others hurried over, still in their pajamas, asking if they could help search. For a few minutes, hope filled the street. Maybe the baby had been taken by someone passing by. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe he would be found safe before the sun reached its highest point. Deputies combed the area, knocking on doors, checking alleys, looking through bushes and yards. K-9 units arrived. Helicopters circled overhead. The search grew, spreading block by block. But as the hours passed, something about the story began to feel uneven. Officers noticed gaps in Jake's account. Small things at first, but enough to slow them down. Details changed. Words shifted. His eyes drifted when he spoke, as if he couldn't hold on to one version for very long. Detectives asked him to walk them through the morning again, then again, and again. Each time a piece moved. Each time a detail faded. By late afternoon, the mood in the neighborhood changed. The earlier rush of volunteers became a quiet cluster of onlookers. People stood together on sidewalks, but didn't speak much. They could feel the truth pressing in, even if they didn't know what it was yet. One neighbor said softly, "Something isn't right." Inside the sheriff's office, detectives continued questioning Jake. He tried to hold on to the story. He tried to keep the morning the way he had described it. But the questions kept coming, each one peeling away another layer. Eventually his voice dropped. He leaned forward, and he admitted that the baby he claimed had been taken never disappeared from the sidewalk. The truth was far worse. Investigators learned that Emmanuel had died earlier that day. The exact circumstances were never fully explained in public, but what they learned was enough to bring charges no parent should ever face. Jake was arrested for second-degree murder and for assault leading to a child's death. Search teams stopped looking for a kidnapper. They began searching for Emmanuel's body instead. Days passed, then weeks. Searchers covered fields, hills, and open land across multiple counties. Deputies used drones, dogs, and every tool they had available. But Emmanuel was never found. The neighborhood where the search began still remembers the long nights after the arrest. Candles appeared on porches. People left teddy bears along the sidewalk where the stroller had once stood. They gathered in small groups, talking quietly about how a baby could vanish from the world without a trace. When the case went to court, Jake stood before the judge and entered a guilty plea. There was no long trial, no long statements, no attempt to shift the blame. He was sentenced to 25 years to life, along with extra time for the assault charge. The courtroom stayed silent as the sentence was read. The only sound was a woman in the gallery letting out a soft cry, the kind that escapes before a person realizes they made a sound at all. Outside, a pastor who lived nearby spoke to reporters. He said, A little boy is gone and his body has not been brought home. Justice matters, but this hurts in a way the law can't fix. People in the community still pray that one day Emmanuel will be found. Some keep candles in their windows. Others place flowers near the area where the search began whenever his birthday comes around. In the months that followed, friends, officers, and neighbors talked often about this case. How trust can break, how silence grows, how harm can take root inside a home before anyone knows to look. Many said they wished they had noticed something sooner. But the truth is that hurt like this rarely announces itself. It hides in quiet corners. It waits behind closed doors. And sometimes it is discovered only when it's far too late. As one deputy said during a small community gathering, a child's life is supposed to be guarded by the people closest to them. When that protection fails, it breaks something in all of us. And that's why Emmanuel's story opens this documentary, because his life, though short, left an echo across Riverside County. An echo that still calls people to look closer, ask more questions, and care deeper for the children living behind the walls they pass each day. Before we move on, let us hold a moment of silence for Emmanuel, a child who deserved mornings full of sunlight, afternoons full of laughter, and nights filled with peace. Now we go to Fresno, where another story, one far larger and even more painful, shook the entire state of California. Case 2, Marcus Wesson and 9 children. Fresno, California, 2004. On March 12, 2004, officers responded to what they first believed was a simple custody dispute at a home on Hammond Avenue. From the outside, the house looked like many others in the neighborhood. Aged wood siding, small windows, a yard that had seen better days. People walked by it for years without giving it a second thought. But inside, a life was unfolding that few could imagine. Marcus Wesson was known for having many children around him. Neighbors saw kids coming and going, but didn't ask many questions. Most kept to themselves. Some assumed one thing, others assumed something else. But no one suspected the truth, not the full extent of it. Wesson controlled the home tightly. Some relatives later said he kept his family away from the world. The children rarely went to school or public places. Most of the time, they stayed behind closed doors. That day, 2 women arrived at the house demanding their children back. They were shouting, crying, begging officers to intervene. They believed their kids were inside and they wanted them safe. Police stepped in. They spoke to Wesson at the door. He was calm. Too calm for the situation unfolding outside. He kept insisting everything was fine, that the children were his. The officers held a line. They asked him to bring the children out. They asked him to cooperate. They told him they just wanted to make sure everyone was safe. He stepped back inside. The door closed behind him. Moments later, a single sound broke the air. A sharp, echoing noise. It froze everyone outside. Officers rushed in. What they found inside stopped them in their tracks. In a small room toward the back of the house, 9 children lay together, all of them gone. Each one had been lost within minutes of the officers' arrival. The youngest was just a baby. The oldest was only slightly older than a teenager. It was one of the most painful scenes Fresno police had ever witnessed. Officers later described a silence inside that home that felt too heavy to hold. They spoke quietly afterward, as if raising their voices might disturb the memory of what they'd seen. Wesson surrendered without resistance. He walked out of the house slowly, hands raised, almost peaceful, while behind him, officers and paramedics stood in a room filled with heartbreak. As detectives uncovered the history of the household, they found years of control and fear, a life cut off from the outside, stories that relatives had tried to tell but never managed to complete, layers of harm that ran deeper than anyone knew. Court proceedings revealed that Wesson had treated his children not as children, but as property under his rule. He made decisions no parent should ever make. He shaped their lives around isolation and obedience. He crossed lines no father should ever cross. When the case went to trial, families filled the courtroom, many holding hands or clutching tissues. Some cried quietly as old memories surfaced. Others sat still, trying to understand how so much harm happened in a home that looked so plain on the outside. Jurors listened to long testimony from investigators, relatives, and experts. They heard how the children had lived. They heard what had happened in those final moments. In the end, the jury convicted Wesson on 9 counts of first-degree murder. He was also found guilty of several other charges connected to the control he held over his family. He was sentenced to death in 2005. But for many people in Fresno, no sentence could fully address what happened in that house. Church groups held vigils. Pastors offered prayers for the children, calling them the little ones who never got to grow. Community members lit candles and placed them near the old wooden house. For days, flowers and stuffed animals covered the sidewalk. People who had never met the children stood together, sharing tears and silence. Some spoke about what more could have been done. Some wondered if anyone had missed signs. Others admitted they had walked past that house for years and never thought to ask questions. A retired officer who was at the scene later said, "You don't forget something like that. You carry it. You think about how fragile life is and how important it is to protect the young." A counselor who worked with surviving relatives said, "Hurt this deep doesn't disappear, but love can help people stand again." To this day, the story of the Wesson children remains one of the darkest chapters in California's history. Their names are spoken in Fresno churches every anniversary. Their memories are kept alive by relatives who refuse to let them fade. And every time people pass that old home, now empty, now quiet, they remember what was lost there. 9 young lives, 9 futures that never arrived, 9 children whose story must be told softly, with honor, and with hope that nothing like it will ever happen again. This case reminds us that true harm often grows in silence, that families can suffer behind doors that look ordinary, that children need watchful neighbors, concerned teachers, and communities that care enough to notice when something feels wrong. California learned that lesson the hard way in 2004, and just 17 years later, another city in the same county would face a tragedy with pain of its own. Now we travel to Lancaster, a home where 4 children lived, laughed, and played, until a single night took them all away. Case 3. Germarcus Lamar David and his family. Lancaster, California, 2021. On the night of November 28, 2021, a call came into the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department from a small home in Lancaster. The man on the phone was calm at first. Too calm, some would later say. His words were brief. He said someone in the house needed help. He didn't say much more. Deputies arrived within minutes. They walked toward the home with flashlights guiding the way. A woman was outside, crying hard enough that her whole body shook. She told them her daughter was inside. She said the kids were inside too. When officers entered the house, they found a scene that none of them were prepared for. 4 young children and their grandmother were discovered inside, each of them gone. The children ranged from just over a year old to 11. Their grandmother, who had been visiting and helping care for them, was 51. The silence in the home felt heavy. One deputy would later say he could still hear the ringing in his ears from how quiet the rooms were. Another officer stepped back outside for a moment, placing his hands on his knees, trying to steady himself. The children, Nehemiah, Germarcus Jr., Caden, and baby Noah, had been seen by neighbors many times. They often played in the yard. Sometimes they chased each other around the small patch of grass in front of the home. Their grandmother loved sitting on the porch swing with the little ones, pointing out clouds and telling stories. But on this night, none of that warmth remained. Detectives questioned the mother first. She was grieving and shaking, barely able to describe what had happened. Her eyes kept drifting toward the door, as if she hoped somehow the kids would walk out alive. She said she had been gone briefly and returned to find the unimaginable. As paramedics worked inside, she kept repeating, "They were just here. They were just playing." Outside, neighbors gathered one by one. Some wrapped blankets around their shoulders, others clutched tissues. A few prayed quietly, heads bowed in the cold night air. Inside, detectives continued searching for answers. The father, Germarcus Lamar David, was taken into custody at the station that same night. Investigators said he showed no signs of being under the influence. He spoke calmly. His answers were short. The detectives interviewing him said very little afterward, except that his statements, along with physical evidence, pointed in only one direction. As they pieced the timeline together, it became clear that the harm happened in a matter of minutes. Minutes that changed the lives of everyone connected to the family. The grandmother, Erica England, had been with the children when it happened. She tried to shield them. Detectives found signs that she fought with everything she had to protect the kids she loved. Her bravery became one of the few bright lights mentioned in court. When the case went before a judge, the community held its breath. The courtroom was filled with relatives on both sides, some crying, some staring straight ahead, some clutching photographs of the children. The charges were read slowly. 5 counts of murder, 1 for each life lost. Germarcus David was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. There were no cheers, no outbursts, just a long, steady silence from the people sitting behind him. A pastor who had known the grandmother spoke afterward. He said she loved the children more than anything. He said she brought them to church whenever she could. He said she prayed for them every night. Her absence left a wound in the congregation. Several members put her picture near the altar for weeks, surrounded by small candles and flowers brought by other families. At the children's school, teachers set up a table with drawings, letters, and tiny stuffed animals. Students asked gentle questions, the kind of questions children ask when they're trying to understand why someone their age won't be coming back. One teacher said the hardest part was seeing empty desks the next morning. She placed 4 small hearts on the table where the children once sat. Neighbors near the home still talk about that night. Some remember the flashing lights. Some remember standing together under the cool November sky, not knowing what to say. Others remember how strangers left teddy bears by the front walkway for days afterward. Lancaster is a place where families lean on one another, where people bring casseroles to grieving homes, where prayers rise quickly when tragedy hits. But this one left a mark that hasn't faded. Many people say they still pray for the mother, who carries a loss no parent should ever carry. Others pray for the grandmother, who tried to save the children she loved. And many pray for the officers who walked into that home, because some scenes follow a person for the rest of their life. These stories remind us that harm inside a home does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in quiet. Sometimes it hides behind familiar faces. And sometimes, by the time anyone realizes what's happening, the moment to intervene has already passed. The tragedy in Lancaster pushed the city to talk more openly about stress, about reaching out, about checking on families who seem withdrawn. It started conversations in churches, schools, and barber shops. People asked how they could help each other better. They asked how to spot signs of trouble sooner. They asked how to keep children safe in a world that can turn dark too quickly. Pain like this leaves many questions behind, but it also brings people together in ways that honor the lives lost. And that brings us to the next case, a story of a child who loved superheroes and playgrounds, a child who trusted his father more than anyone until the day that trust was taken from him. We now move to South Pasadena, where a 5-year-old boy named Aramazd Jr. disappeared, and an entire community searched for him with hope that still hurts to remember. Case 4. Aramazd Andressian Sayar and his son, South Pasadena, California, 2017. On April 22, 2017, officers were called to Arroyo Park after a man was found unconscious near his car. The man was Aramazd Andressian Sr. At first, deputies thought he had been assaulted or suffered a medical emergency. But when they asked where his son was, the little boy he was supposed to be watching, he offered no clear answer. 5-year-old Aramazd Piqui Andressian Jr. was missing. That moment set off a search that stretched through parks, neighborhoods, freeways, and even into other counties. Flyers went up on street poles and shop windows. Volunteers formed lines across fields, calling his name again and again, hoping he'd run out from behind a tree or bush. His mother, Ana Estevez, stood before cameras with tears in her eyes, begging for her son's safe return. She held a photograph of Piqui smiling wide, wearing a superhero shirt. She said he loved playgrounds, movies, and giving hugs that lasted longer than most children his age. But as hours passed with no sign of him, officers began asking more questions about what had really happened that morning. Andressian Sr. claimed he had taken his son to the park. He said he didn't know where the boy went. He said he remembered very little. Detectives noticed something was off. His story shifted slightly with every retelling. There were long pauses where his answers didn't match the evidence. Surveillance cameras showed movements that didn't align with the timeline he described. The investigation widened quickly. Detectives searched the park. They searched nearby water areas. They searched family homes. They searched remote roads along the coast. Nothing. A week passed, then 2. Light rain fell on the posters taped to lampposts around South Pasadena, smudging the ink, but not the hope people carried. Parents held their children a little closer during that time. Teachers spoke softly to worried students. Pastors led short prayers at the start of Sunday services, asking God to protect a little boy they'd never met. Meanwhile, detectives kept pressing. They discovered that Andressian Sr. was in the middle of a tense custody battle. Court documents showed strain and disagreement between him and Piqui's mother. There were signs of anger building long before the boy disappeared. Evidence slowly pointed toward one terrible possibility. The search shifted from rescue to recovery. Weeks later, after investigators noticed that Andressian had traveled to Lake Cachama the morning before the disappearance, they returned to that area with search dogs and specialized teams. The land was quiet. The lake sat still under a pale sky. Detectives combed through the rugged ground inch by inch. In late June, after months of lies and misdirection, Andressian Sr. finally confessed. He admitted he had taken his son's life during a custody dispute. He said he acted out of anger, not madness, not confusion, anger. He then led detectives to the place where he had left his son, near the lake he once called peaceful. The news broke hearts across the state. Some officers cried privately after the recovery. Others stood silent beside the road as the small body was brought home. A few later said it was one of the hardest cases they ever worked. In court, Andressian Sr. stood before a judge with no tears, no expression of regret, strong enough to match the loss. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. When the sentence was read, Piqui's mother wept so hard. She had to be held by family members. She told the court her son brought joy wherever he went, joy that was stolen from her forever. Outside, community members left flowers and stuffed animals near the police station where search updates had been given. Children placed small drawings of hearts and capes, calling Piqui their little hero. A pastor spoke gently during the memorial service. He said, "When a child is taken from us, we ask questions that may never be answered, but even in grief, love holds us steady." Teachers from Piqui's kindergarten class attended, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze. His classmates sent letters to his mother, some written in crayon, some only a few words long. One said, "I miss playing." Another said, "He was kind." To this day, many parents in South Pasadena still think of him when they buckle their children into car seats or walk them to school. His story changed the way people paid attention to custody disputes, emotional strain, and warning signs hidden inside families. It taught the community how fast peace can break, and how deeply a single child can touch the hearts of thousands. The pain of this case didn't stay in 2017. It still lingers in the parks and neighborhoods where people remember searching for him. It lingers in the prayers spoken quietly at bedtime. It lingers in every parent who watched the news and whispered, "Lord, protect my child." Now we move from South Pasadena to South Los Angeles, where 3 brothers lived under the same roof in 2015, never knowing their home would become the place where their lives ended. Case 5, Luiz Fuentes and his 3 sons, South Los Angeles, 2015, sentenced 2020. On September 18, 2015, emergency lines lit up from a 2-story apartment building on the 300 block of East 32nd Street. A neighbor had heard frantic cries and rushed into the hallway. Moments later, she saw a mother running outside, screaming for help, her voice cracking in a way that made everyone nearby stop and stare. Police and paramedics arrived quickly. They ran up the narrow stairwell, guided by the sound of grief coming from inside the unit. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found in the back bedroom. 3 young brothers, ages 8, 9, and 11, were lying still. The room was small, with a bunk bed pressed against one wall and superhero posters taped up above it. Their school backpacks were by the door, ready for Monday. But the life inside that room had ended before sunrise. The boy's mother had been separated from Luiz Fuentes for years, though they still shared the apartment. Neighbors said arguments were common, but they never imagined it would reach this point. Some had heard raised voices, others heard cabinets slammed, but none believed the children were in immediate danger. Detectives quickly learned this was no accident. The harm was intentional, swift, and could not be undone. Fuentes, the boy's father, was found sitting quietly in the living room when officers entered. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He said very little. Detectives later said the silence in that room felt cold and empty. The mother collapsed outside as paramedics carried her away to be treated for shock. Neighbors held her hands, some praying aloud. One woman whispered, "Lord, be with these children," over and over, as if her words could soften the pain of what had happened upstairs. The investigation confirmed that the boys were attacked in the early hours of the morning. There was no chance for them to escape, no chance to defend themselves. They had trusted their father even when he carried so much anger inside him. The crime shocked Los Angeles County. Officers who worked the case later said it never left their thoughts. One detective admitted he had to sit with a chaplain afterward because he couldn't understand why anyone would hurt children who still slept with small toys by their pillows. Years passed as the case moved through the courts. The mother spoke publicly only once, telling reporters through tears, "My boys were kind. They loved to help. They were everything good in my life." In October 2020, Luiz Fuentes finally entered a plea. He admitted guilt to 3 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 78 years to life. The courtroom stayed silent throughout the hearing. No shouting, no anger, just the heavy sorrow of a mother who would never again hear her sons laugh or call her name. After sentencing, a pastor from a nearby church gathered people outside the courthouse. He read a short prayer for the boys, asking for comfort for their mother and strength for everyone touched by the tragedy. Community members placed small candles on the steps, each one flickering as the evening breeze moved through the crowd. At the boys' school, teachers set up a memorial in the hallway. Students wrote messages on colorful paper. "I miss you. You were funny. You were my friend." Some left drawings of soccer balls and cartoons, things the brothers loved. Their classmates held hands during a moment of silence, some too young to understand the details, but old enough to feel the loss. Residents of the apartment building also came together. They planted 3 small trees near the entrance, each one meant to grow tall and strong in memory of the boys. Every spring, when the leaves appear, neighbors say it reminds them of the laughter that once filled the courtyard. The case of Luiz Fuentes forced many families in Los Angeles to look more closely at the signs of anger, exhaustion, and emotional strain inside their homes and neighborhoods. It encouraged people to speak up sooner, to check on children more often, and to reach out when something feels off. One counselor involved said, "Kids often suffer in quiet. They need adults who care enough to see the small signs." Now, as we leave South Los Angeles behind, we move toward another story, one hidden inside a Lancaster home where a father's mind slipped far beyond reason, and two children paid the price. It is a case filled with shock, confusion, and questions doctors still struggle to answer. Case 6, Maurice Taylor Saar and his two children. Lancaster, California, 2020, December 4th, 2020, began like any other Friday morning. People headed to work, kids logged into online classes. But inside one Lancaster home, co-workers of a fitness trainer named Maurice Taylor noticed something was off. He hadn't shown up to virtual sessions. He hadn't replied to clients who messaged him. This wasn't normal. Some clients called the sheriff's department asking for a welfare check. They weren't frightened, just concerned. Taylor had always been reliable. The silence felt wrong. Deputies arrived at the home around midday. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time. When the door finally opened, Taylor stood there. He appeared calm, though officers sensed something heavy in the air behind him. The house was quiet, too quiet for a home with 4 children living inside. Deputies asked to speak with the kids. Taylor stepped aside. What officers found inside will stay with them forever. 2 of the children, a 12-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl, had lost their lives. Their bodies had been left in separate rooms. The scene was disturbing not because of noise or chaos, but because of the cold silence surrounding it. The other 2 children were found alive but shaken. They spoke softly to officers, explaining they had not been allowed to leave their rooms. They hadn't been to school. They hadn't seen friends. They said they had been living in fear for a long time. Deputies gently led the surviving children outside, wrapping blankets around their shoulders as paramedics checked them. The kids looked exhausted, as if they hadn't slept well in days. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering prayers. No one could imagine how something so dark had been happening so close to their own homes. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. They learned the harm had occurred days earlier. They learned the surviving children had been isolated inside the house with the bodies of their brother and sister. And the weight of that knowledge hit investigators hard. Many later said they struggled to speak about it for months. Taylor was taken into custody at the scene. He offered no clear explanation. Detectives asked him questions, but his answers were vague, disjointed, and troubling. Some wondered if he had been struggling mentally long before this day. The district attorney later charged him with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of child abuse. Because the case was so severe, mental health evaluations were brought in early. Court hearings moved slowly as experts examined his state of mind. The community waited, hoping for clarity, though clarity never truly came. At vigil sites around Lancaster, families placed candles, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. One note read, "You were loved. We're sorry no one heard you sooner." Another said, "May angels hold you now." Teachers from the children's old school created a small memorial near the office. Students drew butterflies and hearts, leaving messages on poster boards. Some kids asked if the siblings were in heaven now. Teachers answered with gentle voices, trying their best not to cry. A pastor who attended the vigil said, "When harm reaches inside a home, it tests our faith. But children deserve our prayers, and their surviving siblings need our support." The 2 surviving children were placed in protective care. Community members raised funds for them, hoping to give them some comfort after everything they had endured, though the case continues to move through the court system. the community carries the memory of the two lost children. People still talk about the clients who called for help, how their concern may have saved the surviving siblings. It was a reminder that sometimes a single phone call can change the ending of a story, even if it can't undo the beginning. Lancaster learned once again that families can hide deep struggles behind ordinary doors, and neighbors, even when they don't realize it, may be the only ones close enough to sense when something is wrong. Now the story shifts from a home where mental turmoil took 2 young lives to a case from the 1990s, one that left a mark on Los Angeles County and later influenced how officials look at child protection. It's the story of a toddler named Lance and a father whose anger changed the course of California law. Case 7. David Helms and Little Lance. Los Angeles County, 1995. It was November 7th, 1995, when paramedics rushed into a small apartment in the Santa Clarita Valley area after a call came from a worried neighbor. The voice on the phone said a little boy needed help fast. When responders arrived, they found 2-year-old Lance Helms lying on the living room floor. He was unresponsive. His skin was pale, and his breathing was faint. The mother stood nearby crying, holding a small blanket in her hands as if she was afraid to let it go. The father, David Helms, stood off to the side, quiet and tense. Paramedics asked him what happened. His answers changed from one moment to the next. At first, he said Lance fell. Then he said the boy slipped. Then he said he wasn't sure. But the injuries told another story. Paramedics rushed the child to the hospital, lights and sirens cutting through the afternoon traffic. Doctors worked on him the moment he arrived, but they could tell the trauma was severe. They found internal bruising, injuries that could not be explained by a simple fall, and signs that suggested force. Despite all efforts, Lance died shortly after arrival. The hospital staff stood in silence for a moment. A nurse later said that the room felt colder than usual that day. Another doctor said he walked into the hallway afterward and prayed under his breath. Detectives met with the medical team and carefully reviewed the injuries. They knew right away that this little boy had endured harm over time. Harm that could only come from someone close to him. The investigation moved quickly. Relatives were questioned. Neighbors were questioned. Everyone spoke about Lance, the cheerful toddler who loved to carry around toy cars and laugh when someone made a silly face. The mother told detectives she had been afraid for months. She said David had a temper. She said she tried to protect Lance. She said she never believed it would go this far. Detectives brought David in for questioning. His answers were unclear and full of contradictions. He couldn't explain why the injuries were so severe. He couldn't explain why bruises were at different stages of healing. Months later, the case went to trial. The courtroom was filled almost every day. Family members, child advocacy workers, local residents who wanted justice for a boy who couldn't speak for himself. Doctors testified that Lance's injuries were too serious to be accidental. His internal trauma was compared to the kind seen in high-impact crashes, yet this boy had never been near one. The truth was unavoidable. In 1996, David Helms was convicted of second-degree murder and child abuse homicide. He received a sentence that reflected the life taken from him, the life of a toddler whose world should have been filled with cartoons, juice boxes, and naptime snuggles. But Lance's story didn't end at sentencing. His case became part of California's child safety conversations for years. It reminded social workers, teachers, and police officers to trust their instincts, to ask more questions, to act earlier when something felt wrong. Training programs used Lance's case to show why early reporting saves lives. Some laws later strengthened child protection responses because people wanted to make sure what happened to Lance wouldn't happen again. A small memorial was held by relatives. They gathered at a park, placing tiny blue balloons near a bench where Lance once loved to sit with his mother. His cousins wrote his name in chalk on the sidewalk, drawing hearts around it. A pastor spoke softly, reminding everyone that children belong in safe arms, and that when a child has failed, the entire community carries the sorrow. Lance's mother later became an advocate, speaking to groups about early warning signs and the importance of reaching out for help. Her voice trembled at times, but she kept going. She said she wanted her son's name to help other children live. Stories like Lance's stay with people. They remind us how fragile life is, how quickly harm can escalate, and how important it is for friends, neighbors, and family to notice when something feels off. This case, more than many others, pushed California to strengthen awareness around protecting children who cannot speak up for themselves. Now we move to a case that remained hidden for almost a decade. A father whose crimes were buried for years until one cold case team connected dots that shocked an entire county. A case involving several infants, tiny lives lost long before anyone knew what was happening. Case 8, Paul Perez and the 5 infants, Yolo County, arrested 2020. In 2007, a fisherman in Woodland, California, found a small container along a shallow bank of the Sacramento River. Inside was the remains of a baby boy. The discovery haunted everyone involved. Officers searched the area, but no more remains were found. Without leads or technology advanced enough to help, the case went still. The infant was nicknamed Baby Doe. He had no identity, no clear connection to any missing persons case. Detectives placed his file on a shelf in the cold case room and promised each other they would return to it when science caught up. Years passed. Investigators retired. New detectives joined the department. Through it all, the photograph of Baby Doe remained pinned above a desk. In 2019, Yolo County launched a review of older cases involving unidentified children. This time, they had access to advanced DNA testing, technology that didn't exist when the baby was found. They sent a tiny sample to a laboratory. Weeks later, results arrived that left detectives stunned. Baby Doe was not the only child. His DNA pointed to several infants born to the same father, each one missing, unreported, and never found in state records. The technology connected the remains to a man named Paul Perez, a father who had lived in California in the 1990s. Detectives widened their search. They dug through birth certificates, hospital logs, welfare records, and archived police reports. One by one, they discovered 4 more infants whose birth records existed, but whose lives had no documented future. No school enrollment, no medical visits, no guardianship transfers. Nothing. These children had vanished shortly after birth, and no one reported them missing. Detectives quietly began reconstructing the past. Perez lived a transient lifestyle throughout the 1990s. He drifted between counties. He had a long history of violence, abuse, and instability. He had been in prison multiple times, One investigator later said, "Every new record we found led to another child, and another, and another. It broke all of us." By early 2020, the evidence formed a horrifying pattern. 5 infants, all believed to have died within days of birth between 1992 and 2001. Not one had been reported missing. Authorities tracked Perez down after he was released from a Texas prison on unrelated charges. He was taken into custody and transported back to California. Detectives said his reaction was almost empty. No shock, no confusion. They described his silence as the kind that makes your stomach drop. When the charges were formally announced, the courtroom sat in absolute stillness. Perez was accused of killing 5 of his own children over nearly a decade. Reporters, lawyers, and even officers wiped away tears during the press conference. The district attorney called the case one of the most heartbreaking and horrific crimes in California's history. Community members lit candles along the riverbank where the first infant had been found years earlier. Someone placed 5 small white roses in the water, watching them drift slowly downstream. Another person whispered, "You deserved a life," before stepping back with trembling hands. Faith leaders across Yolo County spoke about the case during their Sunday services. Some prayed for the infants. Some prayed for the investigators who spent years carrying the burden of unanswered questions. Others prayed for the people who never realized these children were gone. Cold case detectives later said that solving Baby Doe's identity felt like giving him a voice for the first time. One officer said, "For years he was alone in a file. Now the world knows his name mattered. All 5 of them mattered. Their names have not been publicly released, but in Yolo County, their story lives on through the officers who fought for them." The case is now used to train new detectives on the importance of persistence, careful records, and trusting instinct when something doesn't feel right. Perez awaits trial facing multiple murder charges. But for most people following the case, the legal outcome, whatever it becomes, will never outweigh the sorrow of what was lost. 5 children, 5 beginnings cut short, 5 little lives carried into the world with hope, only to be hidden away. Yet their story reminds California that truth can rise years later, that no case is too old to matter, that every child deserves to be remembered. And now, we turn to one of the most widely known California cases in modern history, one that captured national attention in 2002 and still sparks emotional debates decades later. A case of a missing pregnant woman and a husband who lied to the country while knowing exactly what he had done. Case 9, Scott Peterson, Lacey and baby Connor. Modesto, California, 2002, conviction 2004. Christmas Eve is usually a day filled with warmth, families making breakfast together, kids shaking gifts under the tree. But on the morning of December 24th, 2002, Modesto police received a call that felt different from the start. A husband claimed his pregnant wife was missing. Scott Peterson told officers he came home from a fishing trip and found the house quiet. No Lacey. No explanation. At first, everyone hoped it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd gone on a walk with the dog. Maybe she was visiting a neighbor. But as the hours passed, it became clear something was terribly wrong. Family members rushed to the house. Friends began searching nearby neighborhoods. Officers canvassed streets, parks, and fields. Lacey's mother pleaded with the public to help bring her daughter home. The community launched one of the largest volunteer search efforts Modesto had ever seen. People who had never met Lassie printed flyers, formed long search lines, and stayed out late into the night holding flashlights. But in the middle of all this hope, small signs pointed to a darker truth. As days turned into weeks, investigators grew uneasy with Peterson's behavior. He didn't seem as anxious as everyone expected. He repeated the same lines without emotion. He gave details that didn't match his earlier statements. Detectives followed every lead, checked every alibi, and looked closely at his timeline. The turning point came when they discovered he had been dishonest about parts of his personal life, things he hid from his family, from investigators, and from the world. Still, investigators needed solid evidence. Then in April 2003, nearly 4 months after Lacey vanished, a couple walking along the San Francisco Bay shoreline found the remains of a baby boy. The next day, Lassie's remains were discovered nearby. When the news spread, Modesto fell quiet. Many people cried openly. Some gathered outside the Peterson home holding candles. Others stopped in the middle of their errands just to bow their heads. Detectives soon announced what many feared. The remains matched Lacey and her unborn son, Connor. Soon after, Scott Peterson was arrested. His trial began in 2004. Families filled the courtroom. Journalists lined the sidewalks. People around the country watched closely, many praying Lacey's family would receive justice. Medical experts explained that the baby had been viable, meaning he would have survived if brought to term. Lassie had been excited to become a mother. She had decorated the nursery and picked out names. She looked forward to meeting her son. In court, Peterson sat quietly as the evidence against him grew. Jurors listened to details of the timeline, phone records, movements on the morning of Lacey's disappearance, and testimony from people who knew the family. After months of testimony, the jury reached a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey and guilty of second-degree murder for baby Connor. In 2005, Peterson received a death sentence. Years later, that sentence was changed to life in prison without parole due to issues with jury selection, not because of innocence. For Lacey's family, nothing brought true peace, but the verdict offered a measure of closure. Her mother said in court, "My daughter deserved to grow old. Connor deserved a chance to be born." Modesto held multiple vigils in their memory. White ribbons lined the streets. Candles covered church entrances. People wrote messages of love and remembrance on poster boards and tied balloons outside the Peterson home. One pastor at a memorial service spoke softly about hope. He said, "Even when the world feels cold, God keeps the light of their lives alive in us." Lacey's friends described her as warm-hearted, always smiling, always ready to make someone feel included. They remembered her excitement about becoming a mother. They remembered the joy she carried into every room. Her story reminded the country of how fragile life is and how trust can be broken in the places where it should be strongest. And now we come to the final case in this series. A story that crosses borders, reaches into the realm of delusion, and shows the danger of a mind lost in dark beliefs. A California father who took his children across the border, convinced himself of ideas that made no sense, and acted on fears that existed only in his own thoughts. What happened next left 2 innocent children gone and an entire nation stunned. Case 10. Matthew Taylor Coleman and his 2 children, Santa Barbara, California, Rosarito, Mexico, 2021. In early August 2021, Matthew Coleman was known in Santa Barbara as a surf instructor. He ran a small surf school. He and his wife were raising 2 children, a 2-year-old son and a 10-month-old daughter. Friends described them as a family who loved the beach, the sunshine, and the simple joy of watching their little ones grow. But behind the smiles, something troubling was happening inside Matthew's mind. He had started believing wild conspiracy ideas that had no connection to reality. He spent hours reading false information online, convincing himself it was true. He hid these thoughts from most people, including those close to him. On August 7th, he quietly loaded his 2 children into the family van. He did not wake his wife. He did not explain where he was going. He simply drove away, heading toward the U.S.-Mexico border. His wife realized they were gone later that morning. She called the police, worried because Matthew had left without their car seats, without food, without saying a word. Authorities entered his name and vehicle into a missing person alert. By then, he had already crossed into Baja California. Around 6 a.m. the next day, hotel workers in Rosarito grew concerned when they noticed Matthew leaving the hotel without his children. They informed local police, who checked the room and parking area. The children were nowhere to be seen. Hours later, their bodies were found near a remote coastal area outside Rosarito. The scene left detectives shaken, their faces pale with grief and disbelief. One officer described the moment as one of the hardest things I've ever seen. Others stepped away to collect themselves. Matthew was located and arrested soon afterward. When questioned by U.S. federal agents, his statements were disturbing. He claimed he believed his children were in danger from imaginary sources. He believed things that were never real. His words made no sense to investigators, who listened with heavy hearts. The truth was simple and painful. He acted based on delusion, not reality. He was indicted in the United States on 2 counts of foreign first-degree murder of U.S. nationals. In later court filings, federal officials stated he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Psychiatric evaluations found he had fallen deeply into false beliefs, losing touch with the real world. He remains in federal custody under treatment. Back in Santa Barbara, the news broke the community. People gathered on the beach where Matthew once taught children how to surf. They built a small memorial in the sand. Candles, seashells, flowers, and handwritten notes. One note said, "Your smiles lit up the beach." Another said, "May the ocean carry you gently." Friends of the family said the children were always laughing. The little boy loved chasing seagulls. The baby girl loved clapping her hands at the sound of the waves. Their mother, overwhelmed with grief, received support from neighbors, church members, and families from the surf community. People brought meals, sat with her in silence, and prayed with her when she could no longer speak. A pastor at a local church addressed the tragedy with a trembling voice. He said, "There are moments when the harm in this world feels too heavy to understand. All we can do is hold the families left behind, lift them in prayer, and trust that God carries the little ones safely home." Counselors in Santa Barbara spoke with families and children who were confused and frightened by the news. Parents tried to explain that sometimes people become lost in their minds and do things they would never have done in a healthy state. They tried to remind their kids that love is supposed to protect, not harm. The case sparked discussions across California about mental health, online misinformation, and how isolation can pull vulnerable people into dangerous beliefs. Families began paying closer attention to their loved ones, checking in more often, asking deeper questions, and noticing warning signs sooner. The loss of those two young children still weighs on Santa Barbara. But their memory continues in the stories their mother shares, in the prayers spoken at local churches, and in the quiet moments when parents hold their children a little tighter at the beach, watching the sunset with gratitude for another day. This tragedy reminds us that minds can break in silence, that people can fall into dark places without anyone realizing it, and that love, real love, seeks help long before harm occurs. Now, with the 10 cases told, we come to the final chapter of this documentary. A moment to breathe, a moment to reflect, a moment to ask what all of this means for us, the viewers, the parents, the neighbors, the people who believe in protecting the innocent. 10 stories. 10 families who lost children they loved. 10 moments where the person meant to protect became the one who caused the deepest harm. Each case hurts in its own way, but they all remind us of something important. Trouble inside a home does not always show itself. Sometimes it grows quietly. Sometimes people see signs but don't know what to do. Sometimes help comes too late. And yet, even in the middle of all this pain, there were people who tried, neighbors who made calls, teachers who noticed quiet children, officers who refused to give up, and communities who gathered to pray and comfort the families left behind. That is where hope lives, not in changing the past, but in caring enough to notice the next child who might need help. If you know someone who feels overwhelmed, reach out. If you see a child who looks afraid or withdrawn, don't stay silent. And if you are the one struggling, please talk to someone, a friend, a pastor, a helpline, anyone who will listen. We honor these children by paying attention, by asking questions, and by choosing compassion over hesitation. May their memories guide us towards safer homes, stronger communities, and hearts willing to help before harm takes root.